Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 7.2, How Syllogisms Work. This corresponds with Section 7.2 of our text, The Reasonable Person. Today we're going to do a little recap of what we've already learned about syllogisms in Section 7.1, and then we will focus in on the fundamental strategy of the categorical syllogism, the thing that makes it all work. I'll tell you the principles on which that strategy is based and then show you a diagram to help us visualize what the strategy is, because that's helpful for a lot of people. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of how we use the strategy in reverse. All right, so in previous episodes, we've reintroduced the idea of inference, the third act of the mind. Inference is how we determine the value of one proposition, the truth value of one proposition, from truth propositions that we already know. The thing that we're trying to determine, the conclusion that we reach, that's called the consequent, and it follows from the stuff we already know. That's called the antecedent. The antecedent goes before, the consequent is what follows as a consequence of the antecedent. It follows necessarily. This is true of all inference. In other words, antecedent and consequent are very, very general terms. We have more particular terms that we use for the syllogism. And with a syllogism, the two premises are the antecedent, and the conclusion that we reach in the third line of the syllogism, that's the consequent. But this antecedent and consequent language, that's true of every kind of inference that you can make. Always. If the antecedent is true, then the consequent follows for any valid inference. All right, so that's about inference. We also went over the fact that we were actually making inferences back in chapter 6. We were making immediate inferences. That is, if you know one thing, then you know the next, and there's nothing in between. That's how our equivalent propositions worked. That's how our opposite propositions worked. And that's how our subalternate propositions worked. At least sometimes, right? With opposites and subalternates, there are some times when you can't extend one proposition to another, but there are other times when you can. And that's what we learned in the square of opposition. What's different now is that we're learning how to make mediated inferences with syllogisms, three-line arguments in which a conclusion purports to follow from a major and a minor premise. The major and minor premise, the antecedent. The conclusion, the consequent. Now, each syllogism has a major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion, and a major premise that contains that term. We always find the major term by looking for the predicate of the conclusion, and we always find the major premise by looking for the major term. The major premise should be written first of the two premises, but sometimes it's not, and that's okay. It's still the major premise if it contains the major term, even if it happens to be second. That's just a mistake, putting it second. But it doesn't change which one is major and which one is minor. There's also going to be a minor term in every syllogism, and it's the subject of the conclusion. And the minor premise is the premise that contains the minor term. It should be written second. But even if it's written first, it's still the minor premise, because we always find our major and minor term from the conclusion, and we always find our major and minor premise from looking for where the terms appear. There is also a middle term in every syllogism. That's the term that's neither the major nor the minor term. It will appear once in each of the premises and never in the conclusion. So, to mark a syllogism, we always find the conclusion first. When we find the conclusion, we mark a P on its predicate, and that is our major term. And then we mark P up above where that major term appears in the premises. And then we put an S on the subject of the conclusion, and that is the abbreviation for the minor term. And then we put that S on the minor term every time that it appears up in the minor premise. And then what's left over? What's left over is the middle term, and the middle term gets to use the abbreviation M. Okay, so let's move on now and focus in on this fundamental strategy of the categorical syllogism. Now, I noted in the text that we often use syllogisms in reverse. That is, we have some question, and the conclusion formulates an answer to something that we either don't know or don't know whether we know, or haven't proven maybe and are trying to prove. So suppose I want to know, are capybaras mammals? Well, another way of reframing that question is, can I find some middle term that unites the concept of the capybara with the concept of the mammal? And I can. For example, if I use the concept of rodents, if I know that all rodents are mammals and all capybaras are rodents, then I will know that it must be true that all capybaras are mammals. This middle term, this intermediate category of rodents, helps me connect what capybaras are with what mammals are. There are others that I could have used that have hair, for example, or they're young or born alive, things like that. But rodents gets the job done and serves as an example. All right, so here's another one. You can do this even with imaginary things. So is the Jabberwock frumious? Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. Well, what does that mean? Is the frumious bandersnatch a different creature, or is that another name for the Jabberwock? It's at least possible that the Jabberwock in the poem is also a bandersnatch. And if that's true, then we would be able to say that all bandersnatches are that which is frumious. Some Jabberwocks are bandersnatches, at least some. And therefore, at least some Jabberwocks are that which is frumious. Now, note that when I put it out this way, I've already confessed that I'm not really sure about whether the second premise is true. I don't really know whether some Jabberwocks are bandersnatches. Indeed, I don't really know whether all bandersnatches are that which is frumious. Is there only one frumious bandersnatch? I don't know. They're imaginary creatures. I can't verify that. But what I can tell you for certain is that if these two premises are true, then that conclusion follows. That's got to be. This is what we mean when we focus in on the validity of the inference rather than the clarity of the terms, the truth of the premises, and the overall soundness of the argument. It's because of the form that we can do this. So, to summarize, the fundamental strategy of the categorical syllogism is to relate the major term to the minor term by relating each of them to some middle term. Whether that's a real thing like rodents, or whether that is an imaginary thing like bandersnatches, either way, the category will work if the form is correct, right? Comparing two things to each other, or relating two things to each other by relating them to something that they can each be related to in common. All right. So why does this work? Well, there are a couple of different principles. We can group them under principles of identity and principles of inclusion. So first, under the general principle of identity, we have these two principles, and it's helpful, I think, to think of them in pairs. The principle of reciprocal identity and the principle of reciprocal non-identity. Reciprocal identity is easily stated. Two things that are each identical with the third thing are identical with each other. That is, if A is identical with C and B is identical with C, then A must be identical with B. That's the first principle. Now, the second one, the non-identity principle, is really, it should be roughly as easy to understand, although it's much harder to state. Two things, one of which is identical with a third thing, and the other of which is non-identical with that third thing, are non-identical with each other. That's quite a few more words, roughly double the size maybe as the principle of reciprocal identity, but all it is the negative version. If A is identical with C and B is not identical with C, then A is not identical with B. It can't be, right? So these are two sides of the same coin. We give them each a different name, but you should see it's the same principle either way. In each case, what we're doing, it's almost as if I had two differently shaped coffee cups, and I wanted to know, is the amount of coffee in those two coffee cups the same? Well, how could I do that? I don't know the weight of the coffee cups. I couldn't weigh it. One thing I could do is I could find a third cup that is large enough to hold the contents of either of the other two, and I could pour first one cup into that, and then I could mark where the edge of the liquid is, and then I could pour it back out, and I could pour the other cup in and see whether it is the same amount of liquid or less liquid or more liquid. In other words, using that third cup as the measure of what the other two cups are. I still might not know how many ounces I have or how many liters or however I'm measuring, but I would be able to tell whether they are or are not alike. That's all that the principle of reciprocal identity and the principle of reciprocal non-identity are doing. And that turns out to be a lot. It turns out to be very important to how the syllogism works. The second pair of principles here are principles of inclusion. And again, we'll take them in a pair. The dictum de omni and the dictum de nullo. The dictum de omni is whatever is affirmed universally of a certain concept is affirmed of every inferior within the extension of that concept. In other words, if all men are mortal, every man is mortal. That's easy enough, right? That's what we learned about with our subalternates, right? The dictum de nullo, whatever is denied universally of a certain concept is denied of every inferior within the extension of that concept. If no fish live in trees, then Nemo does not live in a tree. If all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. If no fish live in trees, Nemo does not live in a tree. This is, again, pretty obvious once we've studied subalternates. But you can tell from the Latin name that these are old and famous concepts in logic. They, in fact, go all the way back to Aristotle. They're now sort of understood as corollaries. In other words, if you didn't have these second principles at all, if no one had ever drawn any attention to them, syllogisms would still work. And it's perfectly possible to explain the syllogism just on the basis of the principle of reciprocal identity and the principle of reciprocal non-identity. But I pass these others along because people who've studied logic tend to assume that you will know what these are. And if you get into a discussion with other people who've studied logic and you don't know them, then wherever I am at that moment, I'll feel an emptiness in my soul that will be hard to heal. So I just want to make sure that all my students know this. Okay, let's move on and visualize the strategy that we're talking about here. So we talked about are all capybaras mammals. Well, this is really what we're kind of doing here. We have the subject of our conclusion, which is capybaras, and we have the predicate of our conclusion, which is mammals. We're going to make mammals our major term, and capybaras is our minor term. And really, we have this question: are they related? Are all capybaras mammals, or are they not? And that's our uncertainty. That's the thing that we don't know. It's right there in the middle. The job of the middle term, represented by the M in this diagram, is to bridge that uncertainty. If I can relate the S to the M and the P to the M, then I can make a bridge over the uncertainty, right? Finding the middle term rodents will do that. By relating each of the minor and major term to the middle term rodents, I can bridge the uncertainty and I will unite S and P. Note also that if I could affirm that capybaras are rodents, but maybe if our major term were reptiles or something, if I denied that rodents were mammals, so I'd just be wrong. But what if I denied that rodents are reptiles? I would still be bridging the gap, but I would be bridging it in a negative way. In other words, and you might not understand this until we get through with section 7.3, there's a difference between a failure to make a connection through the middle term, which is very bad and undermines the whole syllogism, or when you absolutely do make the connection, but the connection shows that there's no the middle term is not equivalent to the major or the minor. That's why we have the principle of reciprocal identity and also the principle of reciprocal non-identity. So when we make the link, making the link in either an affirmative or a negative way will still bridge the gap of our uncertainty. Like this, for example, are Jabberwocks boojums? Well, again, we can set this all up so that we have Jabberwocks as our minor term and we have boojums as our major term, and we're not sure whether Jabberwocks are boojums. Well, if I can find a middle term to relate them both to, like snarks, I might say all boojums are snarks and no snarks are Jabberwocks. And if that's true, then it follows that no Jabberwocks are boojums. That is a valid inference to make for reasons that will become clear to you in 7.3. So that's an example where we have made the connection through snarks. It's just that one of the connections is negative. And the negative conclusion, just like the affirmative conclusion, allows us to bridge our uncertainty. What we end up doing there is separating S and P rather than affirming S and P. All right, so that is the fundamental principle at work and how syllogisms basically work. This is the idea of the syllogism. And when we move into section 7.3, I will start talking about how we know whether it's working or not. See you then.